Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to the National Press Club and today's National Australia Bank Address. It's a pleasure today to actually be able to welcome back both speakers. The last time Malcolm Turnbull was here, it was at the peak of the campaign on the referendum for the Republic, and when he was described as a merchant banker and potential politician. He's now achieved the potential on politics, and he's very much a politician. Brett Kelly was here because he'd just done a rather audacious thing at the age of, I think, 22, of rounding up a whole bunch of very prominent Australians and asking them what they stood for and how they'd got where they were. And he was launching a book based on those interviews. Since then, he received a letter from somebody a young Australian who read that book, borrowed it from a library, and said, yeah, it's very interesting. What are you doing now? What are you doing about it? And he thought, well, I'm not doing much, so I'd better do something about it. And so he's produced a second book. He was asked by that young reader, what have you done since then, and what impact has the process that you went through to bring the book to fruition and the ideas and experience that you gained from the interviews themselves have had on your life and career? Well, he's built on that. He's looked at the life and career of quite a number of people, and he's produced a second book. The first one was called Collective Wisdom. The second one is called Universal Wisdom. And that one today is going to be launched shortly by Malcolm Turnbull, who will, after that, introduce Brett to you to have his say about the things that the future holds and the needs for leadership in Australia. But for a start, please welcome Malcolm Turnbull.
Thank you very much, Ken. Endeavouring to draw moral lessons and wisdom from the lives of great leaders is a very long tradition. I'm not sure whether Brett Kelly's latest book, Universal Wisdom, will be as widely read as Plutarch's Lives, and it's not as salacious as Suetonius's Lives of the Caesars, which also continues to sell well. But certainly Brett is continuing in a very fine tradition, and he has assembled a collection of some of the most influential men and women of our times and sought to draw some common threads of wisdom from their often very tumultuous lives. I was saying to Brett earlier, just as we were having lunch, that the life in this collection, which he'll talk about himself in a moment, that gives me the greatest cause for reflection is that of Nelson Mandela, a man against whom so many wrongs were committed, and then when he emerged from nearly 30 years of imprisonment, forgave all his enemies and united a divided nation. A remarkable example of forgiveness and of love of his fellow men and women and of his country, overcoming the natural human instincts for revenge. Now, as a Member of Parliament, and a very, very new one, I don't think I, however, should be talking very much about wisdom, universal or otherwise. Instead, I propose to discuss folly, a line of work in which most people regard politicians as particularly adept. But before leaving wisdom, I will just illustrate an important distinction between knowledge and wisdom, which are not, of course, the same things. The great English barrister F.E. Smith was notoriously sharp of tongue and intolerant of those less intellectually gifted than himself. Such a tendency, however, is a very good example of folly, not wisdom, especially in an advocate. He was explaining a point of law to a particularly dim judge who in his impatience said, "Mr. Smith, I am no wiser now than I was when you began to address me." Smith responded with a one-liner that delighted the gallery, but probably lost his client the case: "No wiser, my lord, but much better informed." Folly is always easier to find than wisdom, and there is plenty of it about. And one of the greatest follies is to resist change until there is no alternative. Plato said, talking about the creation of the state, that necessity was the mother of invention, and his observation has become an aphorism, and a particularly revealing one at that. because all too often we innovate only when it is too late. Whether it be business, politics, or our own lives, all of us slip too easily into a comfortable and settled status quo, a complacent snooze out of which only a rude shock can wake us. There is no greater folly than complacency, and no more dangerous example of complacency today than in the management of some of our larger cities. And it is my melancholy duty to note, without a tinge of partisanship, that they are all presided over by Labor governments. The former New South Wales Auditor-General Tony Harris astutely described this Labor complacency when he said that Bob Carr's political style had been so successful it had become a model for all other state and territory Labor leaders. Gone is the idea, Mr Harris wrote, that government should lead and should challenge vested interests. It has been replaced by Carr's model. A government should act more like a concierge, offering modest assistance to residents but not intervening. Government should certainly not reform markets or challenge society, even if that is necessary to enable them to meet contemporary problems. But what a contrast with the federal government. With a strong economy offering every temptation to complacency and resting on laurels well won and well deserved from past reforms, John Howard's government approaches its first decade with an enthusiasm for reform as keen as it was on the day it was elected. And of course today is the day that Kevin Andrews introduced the work choices legislation into the House of Representatives, the single most important reform to workplace relations in any of our lifetimes. A remarkable demonstration of that metaphor that John Howard so well described of economic reform being like the horizon, the finishing line that you can never reach, that you have to keep on racing towards eternally. Reform is an ongoing process, a living process, and that is so well demonstrated today. And what a contrast to the Labor governments, and particularly in the cities. Now, I'm speaking about cities because 6 weeks ago, the House of Representatives Standing Committee on the Environment produced a report called Sustainable Cities. Mal Washer was our chairman, although the inquiry had commenced in the previous Parliament with Bruce Bilson as its very capable chair. The report considers the state of our great cities. It describes their unsustainability, and it makes important recommendations about how the Commonwealth can provide further national leadership to ensure our cities are developed sustainably and responsibly. But first, a little background. We are an urban nation. Nearly 2/3 of our population live in our capital cities, and more than 80% live in cities with populations of more than 50,000. 40% of our population live in just 2 cities, Sydney and Melbourne. Now, these cities not only house the bulk of our population, but they are the main drivers of our economy, and becoming more so as services occupy a larger part of our GDP. It has been obvious for many years to all of us that our cities face enormous challenges: congestion, pollution, water and power shortages, to name just a few. We live in the driest continent, yet Australia consumes the most water per capita in the world, 1,540 kilolitres per annum. North America is just behind us, and Europe consumes 665 kilolitres. In a world challenged by global warming, our greenhouse gas emissions are also the world's highest. Another UN report puts us second in carbon dioxide emissions, just behind the USA. With petrol prices rising in response to growing demand from China and India, our dependency on the automobile has increased. It should be decreasing, but it's increasing. Vehicle kilometres travelled has increased by almost 60% in cities like Sydney between 1980 and 2000. Now, are these the inevitable consequences of urban growth? Is this just a byproduct of prosperity, a modern example of where there's muck, there's brass? Not at all. They are the inevitable consequences of years of complacency, of years of folly. We have known for decades that oil was a finite resource. We have known for decades that water is a scarce commodity, not a free good. Yet with few exceptions, state governments have persisted in and exacerbated unsustainable practices to the point where the viability of our cities is at risk. For millennia, a necessary requirement of urban life has been a reliable supply of safe drinking water. The remnants of the Roman aqueducts, which still march across the European countryside, remind us that water science and engineering is a perennial challenge. Great cities have died, literally, when the water ran out. Assuming there are no increases in water supply, all of our largest cities will face a significant water deficit, a gap between sustainable yield and demand. Sydney and Brisbane will be the worse off, with a gap of 38% and 33% within 20 years. To put that in absolute numbers, if you assume Sydney's sustainable yield is 600 billion litres, itself an optimistic assumption, and that is less than Sydney is currently using today, the total demand in 2025 will be 826 billion litres. The New South Wales Government's own Metropolitan Water Plan stated last year, Sydney is using more water than is sustainable. Water could be a key limiting factor on Sydney's future growth and prosperity. And those limits could be considerably more severe than we think. We've seen very significant reductions in rainfall across southern and eastern Australia. The average stream flow from 1911 to 2003 in Perth was 285 billion litres. From 1975 to 2003, the average had reduced to 164 billion litres. If you consider the last 7 years, it's even worse. It's 120 billion litres. Turning to Sydney, there is a grave concern that the estimates of sustainable yield, of 600 billion litres, based on 95-year averages, are no longer valid. If, as it would appear, there has been a real shift downwards in rainfall, and of course an increase in temperature, which increases evaporation, then the long-term averages are quite irrelevant. Sydney's 600 billion litres may be a serious overestimate. For example, the long-term average inflow into the whole Hawkesbury-Nepean system is, over the century, 1,442 billion litres. The average over the period, 1991 to 2002, is 697 billion litres. It gives you an idea of the scale of climate change that we're looking at. Now, more than a decade ago, Sydney Water knew that it needed substantially to augment the water supply for Sydney. This was driven, in their minds, by a growth in demand. That need, of course, is much greater now with this decline in stream flows. There were basically only two viable options: a new dam or large-scale recycling. Everything else was either not big enough or, in the case of desalination, too expensive. The Labor government vetoed both a new dam and raising the dam wall at Warragamba, and then for a decade has done virtually nothing. They just hoped it would rain. But the rains have not come, or at least not in sufficient abundance, and we find ourselves now in the extraordinary situation where our dams are only 38% full. If the drought continues, or if the current weather conditions continue for another 2 years, the city will literally run out of water. And what has been the price of this folly? In a desperate effort to find a quick fix, Morris Yema's government has resolved to build a desalination plant. This plant, likely to cost around $2 billion, is estimated by the government's own consultants to deliver fresh water at a cost of $1.53 per 1,000 litres, per kilolitre. The former Premier, Mr Carr, described desalination as bottled electricity before he changed his mind about it, and that was no exaggeration. As the report, the Sustainable Cities report notes, the energy requirement for desalinating seawater is between 4 and 5 times as high as it is for wastewater reclamation. So this is not only the most expensive water available, it will also generate substantially increased greenhouse gas emissions. For whatever reason, Sydney Water has declined to embrace recycling. There has been the argument that people don't want to drink recycled water, but the reality is there is no need, as many countries have shown, the Israelis being the best example, there is no need to put recycled water back into the drinking water system, even though it can be purified to a level of purity that is much higher, in fact, than the water that is currently coming out of the dams. As Professor Greg Leslie from the University of New South Wales has pointed out recently, the drugs and pathogens which need to be excluded from wastewater when it is being processed have a larger molecular size than the salt which is removed by reverse osmosis when it's processing seawater. So if you believe reverse osmosis can desalinate, as it obviously can, it can certainly purify. But the big issue, which the state government, Mr Scully in particular, has only just started to acknowledge today in this morning's papers, The big issue is that this plant will be an extraordinary white elephant. A plant of this kind has to be built on a take-or-pay basis. The normal arrangement for big plants of this kind, desalination plants, is that the take-or-pay alternative is 60% of the contract price. So if the plant is to provide, say, 180 billion litres, which was the scale talked about, at $1.50 a litre, that's $270 million a year. If rains come, the dams are full, the state would be up for 60% of that, over $150 million for water it never received. But it's clearly better to pay 90 cents for water you don't receive than $1.50 for water you don't need. On the other hand, recycling achieves an important environmental objective. It cleans up the oceans regardless. So even if you have plenty of water, even if the dams are full, you at least are not polluting the ocean. Now, the federal government has shown real leadership in terms of water. The National Water Initiative, which was initiated by the Howard government and which the states have supported through COAG, has $2 billion of Commonwealth money in the Australian Government Water Fund to be spent over 5 years. A key objective of the National Water Initiative in the context of urban water reform is to encourage the reuse and recycling of wastewater where cost effective. But in Sydney seems to be going in a completely perverse direction with respect to its management of water. But it's not just water. Consider transport. The major problem in our cities today is car dependency because of pollution and because of congestion. Professor Peter Newman, the Sustainability Commissioner, told the House Committee that cities with strong rail systems are 45% wealthier than weak rail cities because residents, the economy does not have to spend as much on people getting to and from their work, to and from the schools and so forth. Car transport is expensive. If the passengers who currently use rail to travel each day into the Sydney CBD were to shift to cars, an additional 65 lanes of freeway and 782 hectares of car parks would be needed. This would require a multi-storey car park 1,042 floors high. Now, I mention that with some trepidation because, having regard to the propensity of the state government, they're quite likely to try and build one of these things in a public-private partnership and then provide all sorts of barriers and congestion and traps to force people to use it, which of course is exactly what they've done with the Cross-City Tunnel. You know, the extraordinary perversity of the management of Sydney, and this I think is the worst managed state in Australia, and certainly the worst managed city, is that at a time when we should be promoting mass transit and providing real, safe, reliable, speedy alternatives to private automobiles, for a whole range of reasons which are too obvious to repeat to you. What have we done? We have made the cars faster and we've slowed down the public transport. We've actually created incentives to make people not use public transport. Take the Cross-City Tunnel. In return for a large upfront fee and potential revenue shares in the future, the government has created congestion in Australia's biggest city through street closures and other changes to compel use of the tunnel, and then imposed a real substantial financial liability on itself and through it the taxpayers of New South Wales if it dares to open those streets, which it appears to have sold to the owners of the tunnel for all practical purposes, or, heaven forbid, dares to improve the quality of public transport so as to diminish the appeal of the Cross-City Tunnel. Now, what is wrong here? We have in our largest city, where the need for sustainable water and transport policies is manifest, a government which has rejected recycling of water and opted instead for a gas-guzzling, polluting and very expensive desalination plant, and at the same time allowed over a decade $12 billion to be spent on private toll roads, created congestion around those roads to compel drivers to use them, and at the same time as they have sped up the motor cars, slowed down the trains and buses. It is as though the state government, the Carr government, the Yemma government has decided to do exactly the reverse of what a sustainable city needs. So what's the answer? The report that I mentioned, the Sustainable Cities report, notes that the National Competition Policy addressed a great priority of making Australia competitive. and it provided incentive payments to states and penalties, carrots and sticks, and we've all seen the benefits of that. I mean, much of the great economic growth of the Howard years has been due to the improvements, the competitive improvements brought on by the National Competition Policy. The report recommends we take that model and establish a Sustainability Commission which would agree on sustainability benchmarks against which government policies at all levels would be judged. The allocation of Commonwealth funds, especially to transport, water and other infrastructure, would depend on meeting those benchmarks, which would of course also apply to the Commonwealth. Incentive payments should also be considered to reward governments which meet the benchmarks. Now, this would reinforce the leadership shown already by the federal government with respect to sustainability. I've mentioned the National Water Initiative. Consider AusLink, which has included $1.8 billion in funding for rail projects that should double the freight capacity of the North-South rail network within 5 years. The Australian Government Water Fund has the capacity of doing the same thing with water. But there is a lot of Commonwealth funds. There are a lot of Commonwealth funds, both in terms of direct funds and in terms of tax concessions, which are being used by state governments and local governments directly and indirectly without any regard to ensuring that our cities, that our communities are sustainable. We mustn't allow necessity to be the mother of innovation here. We mustn't leave this innovation until it is so compelling that we have no choice. We should continue the reform that has been shown by this government over the last decade and move on to sustainability, recognising that it has important environmental, social and economic objectives, and enable the federal government to provide the leadership that only it can provide across the nation to ensure that as we plan and develop our cities and our communities, large and small, sustainability is a key priority. Now, Brett Kelly, our author, who kindly asked me to launch